So it's about 10 to 10 a.m. on a gorgeous and very, very hot sunny morning here. One of the last ones we'll have in July. I'm sat in my car, and behind me, somebody is just starting to wake up. Hello, Papa. While my wife is working and I'm on school holidays, I am daddy daycare. So today we've decided to take a little stroll at a little nature reserve not too far away from us. I have been up since the early hours, and somebody doesn't care. I thought I'd do a slightly different one today. The fitting setting is that I'm here with my daughter, my nearly 8-month-old daughter, who's absolutely gorgeous, but is resolutely going through a bit of a developmental leap at the moment and is deciding that sleep is for losers and screaming is definitely what you do. But she's really nice this morning and really relaxed, or at least for now. And I thought it'd be quite an interesting one to talk about one of my favourite poems, and actually the first poem of Philip Larkin's I ever read. Yes, Rosie, I know. You know what's coming. It's This Be the Verse. This be the verse. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. So I'm now just pushing the pram, and Her Highness, of course, down this little sandy pathway, and it's a gorgeous day, as it often seems to be when I do these recordings, and it's really very, very verdant round here, although we're just starting to get that first hint of how hot it's going to be later on, and it's barely even 10 o'clock. So I still remember the first time I ever heard this poem, and I'm going to embarrass him a little bit here because I know he listens, by my old sixth form teacher, and that's Pete Winfield. He won't appreciate me calling him old, but I mean my former sixth form teacher. He also happens to be getting on in years a bit, and he'll give me a slap for that, I'm sure. I didn't realise poets could swear. I sort of just assumed naively that if it was on the curriculum, it couldn't have naughty words in it. That would be wrong. I thought poetry was a bit dry. I'd obviously read all the ones in the anthology when I was doing GCSE. I did enjoy the war poems from Wilfred Owen a little bit, and one or two of the Benjamin Zephaniah poems I thought were quite funky and interesting. But to be honest, my poetry sort of journey, if you like, really began with a warm September afternoon and Pete Winfield standing up in front of us, having I didn't know this at the time, of course, but having taken some time out from teaching and came back in and got to teach the unit on Larkin, and standing in front of a room full of lower sixth students, he stood up and just belted this poem out, and it was a watershed moment for me. It helped that Pete had that sort of aura about him too. The reason I thought he was such a wonderful teacher, and I'm still in touch with him now, and I'm lucky enough to consider him a friend, but I didn't have him for more than one academic year. I think it's just testament to how these things can often go. It's not the length of time that you know somebody, it's the impact that they have. And one of the things that I loved about Pete, and I still do, but as a teacher, he was just very real. I think it's easy to become a bit pretentious and highfalutin when you teach English. You can get a bit up your own bum about things, and he was not. He's very, very much a normal bloke, liked his football, very talented man too. Did a bit of financial advising as well as being an English teacher. I mean, God, I can barely do my sums, let alone that. But more than anything, it was just a sheer passion and fire, and telling us all about what Larkin was like as a guy, which I think at the time made you go, oh God, what a miserable individual. Little did I know I'd be so drawn to his poems. And actually it was Pete who, when I sort of expressed how much I had enjoyed reading High Windows, which was obviously the collection that we were studying, he recommended me The Wits and Weddings. Sort of, I think, and I'm hoping he's not annoyed if I get this slightly wrong, I think that he said it was his favourite collection, which I can see why. For me, it's difficult for me because I get the two mixed up sometimes. I can never quite remember which ones were definitely High Windows, which ones were Wits and Weddings, bar obviously the obvious one. But it reminded me a few years ago when I picked up my old copy of High Windows and I saw the scrawlings of my scrawny, intellectually feeble 16, 17-year-old self and thought, Jesus wept. But it began something quite special, because I think what he recognised and what I recognised was that this was poetry that was very, very accessible without being dumbed down. It's incredibly tight and tough, and that's one of the things that I think is so special about Larkin. He can make this stuff look simple when it's anything but. So before I talk about the poem itself, I think it's probably pertinent that I talk about fatherhood. I've been a dad since the 3rd of December of 2023. I've had no time at all in the saddle, and I was describing it to a childless friend of mine the other day, and I'd always been a bit like Larkin. I'd always been the kind of person that thought, oh my God, baby bores, I'm never interested in being someone like that. The kind of people that the minute that they have a kid, that's it, their entire life grinds to a halt, you never see them anymore, they can't do anything without their kid. I won't lie, I did, and for a very long time, especially in my 20s, really looked down on that sort of world, because it wasn't something I recognised. And like most things that you're scornful of, you do it because you don't really understand. You do it because you're intimidated and frightened. But I described it as essentially being, there was a part of my heart I didn't know existed until Rosie came along. Yes, I'm talking about you. Yes, I am. She got hiccups. There you go. Pop you up. Is that better? And yet, with all of that being said, with all of that love and all of that life-changing stuff, fuck me if it isn't really hard graft. My God. I've never known tiredness like it. I've never known sleep deprivation could actually drive you to the point of what feels like genuine insanity. And this is the thing, you can have two things that are true all at once. One of them, of course, is that when you're childless, you find yourself wondering, how do people do it? And you sort of sit back and go, glad that's not me. And then when it is you recognise that it's just so difficult. And yet, our baby, and I don't mind sort of going into this because I think it's part of the podcast is a little bit about me for anyone that cares. I have a rare genetic condition called Huntington's disease. I'm very fortunate that right now it's not affecting me with symptoms, but I'm 36. I will have symptoms in my lifetime. Hopefully not, anytime soon, but it's there. I found out that I had the gene a couple of years ago, and it's been a bit of a big one, really. My dad had it, and he was showing symptoms, and he died suddenly before they could really sort of take hold. So having Rosie was a massive thing for us because it's a 50-50 chance of passing on the gene. And I originally said, well, there you go, that's a sign, maybe we won't bother having kids. And my wife, who I love very much, said, essentially, I think if you're going to go that way, you've got to exhaust every option first. Don't choose fear. I'm glad that she said that, because actually the thought of a world without Rosie is one I don't want to think about. And so I suppose I also have to remind myself that in the build-up to us having the PGD, which is what it's called, the treatment, where they were able to essentially isolate the Huntington's gene by identifying the embryos that had it and discarding them and only moving forward with ones that weren't affected, which was a very, very intensive process for my wife. She had to do a huge amount of injections and other medication, which was very unpleasant for her. And then, of course, we had to go through the IVF process, where she had to have the artificial sort of, stuff with the insemination and egg collection. So, I look at all of this and I'm absolutely amazed that we could even do it. I also have to remind myself that there were plenty of people that we saw in that fertility clinic for whom this was not their second or third time trying unsuccessfully. It was maybe their fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth time. So if I'm ever feeling a little bit about waking up at 4 a.m. to deal with madam here, I try to think about that, because there are plenty of people for whom having children is not something that they can do, at least not easily, and in some cases not at all. And so it would be incredibly churlish of me to say anything other than what an absolute blessing it is. But yeah, two things can be true at once. All of that is absolutely true. And in the moment, sometimes you can be going, oh my word, what is sleep? Or even things like today, in our world where more and more both families have to work in order to provide an income to keep a roof over your head. In my summer holidays, I know that I have to do a lot more of the heavy lifting with daycare stuff, because it's not fair otherwise. Finally found some shade, my word. So, to the poem, I guess. I feel like This Be the Verse. It's a really odd title in a way. It's one of the few poems I think that Larkin has where I don't really understand the actual link there between the title and the poem. It almost seems completely incongruous. Maybe I've missed something. Maybe I've missed something really obvious. If you know, obviously get in touch with the PLS and you can explain what an absolute dimwit I am. But this be the verse, the way that it's set out like a fun bit of doggerel, which in many ways it is. This poem maybe doesn't stand up to rigorous analysis because it is almost designed to be, it's like a bit of a party trick almost. It's one of the poems I can recite because it's just, the rhyme is there. It's done in the style of a fun sort of almost Hallmark thing. It could be the kind of thing which you put into a new parent card if you have a particularly wicked sense of humour. But it's very difficult to find fault with a poem in which the second word is fuck. I think that's genius, really. Why not use another word, Philip? Why not have another word? Why not mess or stuff or any other one-syllable word that could potentially do the same job? And then I realised that it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't be the same. This poem would never have entered popular consciousness because sometimes swear words are the best word. And I think it's important we talk about that. I mean, this is the kind of thing that, just thanks to that word there, it will never ever end up on the BBC's introducing or uploading. But I do think it's important that we talk about it. It's a great word. No word can vigorously emphasise something quite as much, I think, as fuck. It's perfect because you can be fucked up, fucked off, to fuck off, fuck you, fuck up, all those things. And it's very hard to do it justice without that word, I think. Without that word, this poem sort of just doesn't really get off the ground. But let's talk about the actual sentiment of it. They fuck you up your mum and dad. Do they? Do they, Rosie? What do you think? I mean, her silence is probably quite incriminating there. I guess she's nearly 8 months old, and in that time, what bad habits or bad behaviours have already been imprinted on her from me and from my wife? You could argue that maybe quite a few. Also quite a lot of good things, I'd like to think. But again, the idea that we pass things on, and it's why it felt quite pertinent talking about the Huntingtons with my dad. It was something that has been in our family for generations. My gran had it, my dad had it. We don't know who must have had it before on my gran's side of the family, but whoever they were, you know, they would have had a worse quality of life. And of course, the further back in history we go, the more problematic it all becomes, because we don't know. We don't have the records from that side of my family, but there's a good chance they would have ended up in some sort of sanatorium or, you know, madhouse because of the time they were living in. And that does feature in this poem too, with the fools and their old style hats and coats. But more on those guys later. Let's get back to the thrust of it. They fuck you up your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. You grow up with people telling you, oh, you look like your mum, oh, you look like your dad, oh, you sound just like your dad there, oh, you said that thing that your dad says, or you do. And a bit of you wants to say, well, obviously, unless you get raised far away from your biological parents by completely different people, you are going to be like the people that bring you up. Duh. And yet, it's kind of spooky that there are some things that seem to be innate because of your DNA. There are other things which maybe aren't actually to do with that at all, and they're to do with the idea of, you know, not having anything in common with your parents as a personality. And everyone goes through rebellious phases where they don't like their parents, they don't trust their parents, they think their parents are lame, they think they're sad, they think they're out of touch, and, you know, all of these things are definitely part of life and part of growing up. But to actually, you know, fill you with the faults they had, does that mean had as in when they were kids? Or does it mean when they're long gone, you still remember those faults? I don't know. But it's a funny use of the past tense. What are these extras? They add some extra just for you. Crumbs. Typical Larkin style, he just piles it on here a little bit. Like it's bad enough that you're getting filled with their faults, but then they add something else that's actually just for you, almost like a special delivery. Again, could that be due to time of life, time of being born? You know, being born at a time of economic uncertainty, or being born at a time of climate change, or being born at a time of, you know, worsening inequality. Well, that's not the parents' fault. Well, not directly at least. But they did make the choice to have kids, and that is an age-old argument of, is it selfish to bring children into a world where you're not so sure if it's a good place to bring kids into? Don't know. It's certainly one that Larkin wants us to ponder. And then the next line sort of almost exonerates them, you know, but they were fucked up in their turn. It wasn't their fault they ended up this way, the same as it's not your fault you end up the way that you are. They had this done to them by these fools. It's funny, the word fools crops up quite a lot in Larkin's poetry. I've discovered it more through doing this. He uses fools quite a lot. It's a lovely withering word, really. Fools in old style hats and coats. Again, not old fools, not the old fools that we get to meet further down the line, or maybe we do, I don't know, but in old style hats and coats. Maybe they weren't that old, but the time period decreed that they dress in a certain way, and he's poking poking quite malicious fun here at the idea of being younger than they seem and yet old at heart in terms of the time they're living. You can imagine as well different social attitudes, even in my lifetime. But the idea of people being old style, it says, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. I wonder what soppy stern's supposed to really mean. Is it just a nice bit of sort of sibilance there, soppy stern, a nice bit of juxtaposition between them, to essentially no longer be nice to one another and then they start being stern? Or maybe it's because of traditional gender roles and half at one another's throats. Well, I think there's no doubt that raising a child can be very stressful for a marriage or a relationship of any kind. I'm very fortunate to be with someone who is incredibly patient and loving and caring, and yet a few four-letter words have been thrown my way from her at times recently when I've expressed impatience with things or stuff like that. It can be quite tough, and part of it is that we don't necessarily know what we're doing, and parents from back in the day knew even less. The literature wasn't there, the science wasn't always there, and you had people from a much older generation telling you how you should do things. Then we get the more typically Larkin-esque doom and gloom. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. A bit of me thinks, I can almost imagine him smirking away gleefully to himself as he wrote this. Not really meaning it, but sort of the hyperbole of it all is quite pleasing. Man hands on misery to man by having children, this sense of passing on a bundle from one person to the next and saying, here you go, your turn now. And the idea of a coastal shelf is quite an interesting image, this idea of something elemental being, far down out of reach, but unable to be touched or sort of fathomed in quite the same way. Why do we keep doing this to ourselves? Morning.
Maybe we stay, because originally I thought, we could get a high club and stay.
And then we have this: get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. I've always been puzzled by get out as a concept. Is that die? Or exit the gene pool by not having children yourself, which is what I think is deliberately meant. But get out of it almost feels like someone deciding to escape from life. Maybe not all life, but just that life. And it's very hard not to read this with Larkin as himself, even though the poetic speaker is decidedly sort of more cartoonish and mischievous in some ways. I think it's quite important that we do look at Larkin's personal life when considering this poem, because how can you not? He was essentially a lifelong bachelor and never really had, I don't think, any proper desire to have children at a time when it would have still been considered weird to just completely not want it at all. And I can understand. I used to draw horrified looks from people, polite company. Especially when I was about sort of 25, 26, and my wife and I, then just boyfriend, girlfriend, were together. And I expressed that I never wanted to get married, I never wanted to have kids, and I was fine with the idea of having a bit of a nomadic lifestyle and travelling around wherever life took me. In many respects, I was a twat, And I think it's completely fair to say that sometimes real life does take hold and beds in on you, like this coastal shelf that Larkin speaks of here. But also, you know, what were his reasons? Were they all based on fear? For someone who was so frightened of death and frightened of oblivion and the end, it's quite strange to think of him being someone that wouldn't want to live on in some way through an air. I know, girlie. At the risk of sounding incredibly patronising, I do think that he's missed out. And it's a shame that there aren't a line of Larkins still living. But there we go. It's difficult for us to put our more sort of interested ideas onto this. And as I sit here outside Fleet Pond's main sort of viewpoint here, I've got a very smiley girlie looking at me, and I've got some nice duckies for her to watch as well. I thought what I'd do, at the risk of being sacrilegious, is add an extra stanza on the end of this poem, which I think would properly figure that one out.
Luke, come here.
That is bizarre. Someone who's got the dog with the same name as my daughter. Don't take it personally, girl. That noise you just heard was Rosie attempting to eat my recorder. And now we got it on tape. You heard it here first, folks. She said dada first and not mama. But I do like my life the way it is, so maybe I won't tell her that. She doesn't listen, it's fine. But though the fools don't see the years that marches onward with no cures, might understand how to heal fears with a small hand just holding yours. Come on, let's get you back home.